The forest grew silent as Makia approached the impossible structure. A weathered cabin balanced precariously on a single twisted leg of pine, swaying gently despite the still air. Ancient warnings from his grandfather echoed in his mind, tales of boundary places where the spirit world leaked into ours. Yet hunger drove his people to new hunting grounds, and duty pulled him forward. The door creaked open at his touch, revealing a darkness deeper than night. Objects suspended in midair, shadows moving against the light. And in the center, something waiting that knew his name. What ancient evil had he disturbed in this forgotten corner of the forest? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Makia knelt beside the deer tracks, his weathered fingers tracing the indentations in the soft earth. 58 winters had etched deep lines around his eyes that had watched the changing of his people's world with quiet resignation. The ceremonial hunting knife at his belt, passed down through 5 generations, caught the dappled sunlight filtering through the pines. The spirits are restless today, his father had warned that morning, the old medicine man's voice cracking with age. The boundaries grow thin where the old forests still stand. Makia had simply nodded, honoring his father's wisdom while privately dismissing the supernatural concerns. The drought had stretched into its 3rd season. Game had retreated to unfamiliar territories. His people needed meat, not superstitions. His daughter Ayana had been more direct. "Grandfather speaks of spirits while children go hungry," she'd said, adjusting the modern rifle slung across her back, a tool Makia refused to use despite its efficiency. "We cannot feed our families with ancient stories." The conflict pained him. Caught between worlds, Makia respected the old ways while recognizing their limitations. He touched the knife at his belt, feeling the worn bone handle that had guided so many hunters before him. The tribal council had debated for days before approving this expedition. The northern hunting grounds were traditionally forbidden, not because of tribal boundaries or government restrictions, but because of legends older than memory. "Something dwells there that should be left undisturbed," Elder Noshi had cautioned, his blind eyes seeming to see beyond the council fire. The balance must be maintained, but balance meant little to empty stomachs. As the tribe's most accomplished hunter, the responsibility fell to Makia. The trail led deeper into the old-growth forest where few of his people ventured anymore. The trees grew more massive here, their canopies blocking most sunlight. Birdsongs had gradually silenced over the past hour, a detail that stirred unease in Makia's gut. Even in drought, the forest should never be this quiet. He paused to drink from his water skin, surveying his surroundings with practiced eyes. Something felt wrong. The air hung unusually still, carrying neither the scent of animals nor the usual forest decay. His hunting instincts, honed through decades of tracking, signaled danger despite no visible threat. Keme, his sister's son, who had insisted on joining the expedition, emerged from a thicket of ferns 20 paces away. The deer tracks split eastward, the younger man called, excitement coloring his voice. At 32, Keme possessed strength and enthusiasm, but lacked Makia's patience. "Something has scattered them," Makia replied, frowning. "Healthy deer don't change direction without cause. Perhaps a mountain lion," Keme suggested, approaching. Makia shook his head. No predator signs, no broken branches from fleeing prey. He stood slowly, his knee protesting the movement. Something else disturbed them. Keme's expression sobered. "Grandfather's warnings." "I speak only of what the forest tells me," Makia answered, unwilling to admit the growing disquiet in his spirit. He drew the ceremonial knife, studying the intricate carvings on the blade, symbols of protection that had guarded hunters for generations. The knife seemed to grow warmer in his hand, an impossible sensation he tried to dismiss. "We should separate," Makia decided, returning the knife to his belt. "Cover more ground before nightfall." "The people cannot wait another day for food." "The council said we should stay together in these lands," Keme reminded him. "The council is not here," Makia replied. "You track the eastern path. I will follow this trail northward. We meet at the split oak before sunset. Keme hesitated, then nodded. Take care, uncle. These woods feel different. As Keme disappeared among the ancient trees, Makia continued alone, the knife at his belt growing inexplicably warmer with each step toward the unknown territories that lay ahead. Dawn had barely broken when Makia prepared for the hunt. His father waited by the small fire outside their home, frail hands working methodically on a small deerskin pouch. The old man's fingers, though bent with arthritis, moved with practiced precision as he added pinches of herbs and tiny objects Makia couldn't identify. You cross boundaries today, his father said without looking up. This will offer some protection. Makia accepted the medicine pouch with appropriate reverence, though doubt clouded his mind. The northern territories are just forests like any other, he said gently. The stories are meant to keep children from wandering too far. His father's weathered face hardened. Not all stories are for children. He took Makia's hand, pressing the pouch firmly into his palm. Some are warnings passed down because each generation hopes the next will never need them. Something in the old man's tone silenced Makia's skepticism. He slipped the medicine pouch around his neck, tucking it beneath his shirt, where it rested cool against his skin. What dwells there? He asked finally. His father stared into the dying embers. Something old, something that remembers when our people first came to these lands. He looked up, eyes suddenly clear and penetrating. If you see a dwelling where none should stand, turn away. No matter what calls to you, no matter what you think you understand. A chill ran through Makia, despite the morning warmth. Before he could question further, Kemi approached, eager to begin the journey. The conversation ended with an embrace that felt strangely final. 3 days of tracking had led them deep into unfamiliar territory. The medicine pouch, forgotten during daytime treks, now seemed to pulse against Makia's chest as shadows lengthened. The trees are different here, Keme observed as they made camp on the third night. Older, twisted in strange ways. Makia nodded, noticing how some trunks spiraled unnaturally, their bark patterns forming shapes that almost resembled symbols. He busied himself with the fire, pushing away the unsettling thoughts. My mother says these lands were abandoned even before the white man came, Kemi continued, voice dropping instinctively. That our ancestors found something here they could not defeat, only contain. Your mother tells too many stories, Makia replied, more sharply than intended. He softened his tone. The drought has driven the game here because few hunters venture this far. That is all. Keme fell silent, but his eyes darted nervously at every sound from the darkening forest. That night, Makia dreamed of a house standing on one leg, swaying like a dancer. He woke, clutching the medicine pouch, which had grown unnervingly warm. The fourth morning brought heavy mist and an oppressive stillness. No birds called, no insects chirped. Even the wind seemed to have abandoned this place. We should find water and fresh tracks, Makia instructed, fighting his growing unease. Separate and circle back by midday. Cover more ground, Keme hesitated. The silence. It isn't natural. Animals sense hunters, Makia explained, not believing his own words. Go east along the ridge. I'll head north through the valley. After Kime departed, Makia touched the medicine pouch beneath his shirt. For the first time in decades, he whispered the protection prayer his father had taught him as a boy. The words felt strange on his tongue, like visiting a childhood home long abandoned. The pouch seemed to respond, a subtle warmth spreading through his chest. Whether from ancient magic or his own imagination, the sensation brought unexpected comfort. Bow in hand, Makia moved silently through the mist-shrouded trees. The further north he traveled, the more the forest changed. Trunks grew more twisted, moss hung in patterns too deliberate to be natural. And always, the silence pressed in, broken only by his careful footsteps. Then he saw it, fresh deer tracks cutting clearly through soft earth. Not the desperate wanderings of starving animals, but the confident stride of healthy prey. Food for his people, salvation from failure. Makia touched the medicine pouch once more, then followed the tracks deeper into the waiting forest. The deer tracks led Makia through increasingly dense underbrush. The mist clung to the forest floor, swirling around his ankles like living things, seeking purchase. He paused when the tracks suddenly veered sharply left, a sign of startled prey. Something had frightened the deer, yet there were no predator signs. That's when he noticed the trees. The pines around him bore markings, not the casual scars of lightning or animal claws, but deliberate patterns carved deep into bark. Some resembled the ancient symbols his people used, but distorted, as if remembered imperfectly or deliberately changed. Makia's fingers traced one symbol that almost matched the protection glyph on his knife handle, but with unsettling differences. The carving wasn't weathered like decades-old markings should be. The edges remained sharp, the exposed wood still pale. "Recent work, someone else hunts here," he whispered, though he believed it less than the alternative, that something else marked these boundaries. 10 paces ahead, something white gleamed against the dark forest floor. Makia approached cautiously, bow half-drawn. There, nestled in a bed of moss that grew in an unnaturally perfect circle, lay a carved deer antler, unlike any tribal craft he recognized. The antler had been intricately carved, with spiraling patterns that seemed to move when viewed from different angles. Tiny figures were etched along its curve, human-like but wrong in subtle ways Makia couldn't immediately identify. Too many fingers, limbs too long, faces with features that didn't quite align. Against every instinct, Makia reached for the antler. The moment his fingers touched the smooth surface, a jolt ran through his arm. The forest dimmed momentarily, as if the sun itself hesitated. The medicine pouch against his chest turned ice-cold. He should leave it. Return to Keme. Leave these hunting grounds. Instead, he lifted the antler carving. It weighed almost nothing, despite its size. The material felt wrong, not like natural bone, but something harder, smoother. The figures seemed to writhe beneath his touch, though when he looked directly at them, they remained static. "Who made you?" he asked aloud, his voice sounding flat in the unnatural silence. Something rustled in the undergrowth behind him. Makia whirled, bow raised, but saw nothing. Yet the sensation of being observed intensified. The weight of unseen eyes pressed upon him from all directions. Clutching the antler carving, he resumed following the deer tracks, which now moved erratically, as if the animal had been confused or disoriented. The mist thickened as the afternoon light began to wane, casting the forest in premature twilight. Then the trees opened into a small clearing, and Makia froze. In the clearing's center stood a structure that violated every natural law. A weathered cabin, constructed of dark wood that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the fading light, balanced impossibly on a single leg of twisted pine. The leg was bent like a knee joint, allowing the entire dwelling to sway gently despite the absolute stillness of the air. Makia's breath caught. His father's warning echoed, "If you see a dwelling where none should stand, turn away." The antler carving in his hand grew warm, then hot, the carved figures now visibly moving, their misaligned faces turning toward the impossible house. Rational explanations failed. No human craft could balance such weight on a single support. No natural force could explain the gentle swaying without wind. As if responding to his thoughts, the cabin's single door swung open. No light escaped from within, only a darkness deeper than night, a void that seemed to pull at his vision. The antler carving burned against his palm, but Makia couldn't release it. A whisper emerged from the cabin's open door, so faint he might have imagined it. His name. The voice knew his name. Makia's legs moved of their own accord, carrying him forward across the clearing toward the waiting door. The medicine pouch at his chest pulsed with cold, a counterpoint to the burning antler in his hand. Every story his father and the elders had told, every warning about the northern territories, they crashed through his mind as his feet continued their betrayal, bringing him step by step to the threshold of the impossible house. The threshold beneath Makia's feet seemed to pulse as he crossed into the impossible house. The door swung shut behind him with a finality that sent a shudder through his body. He stood motionless, allowing his vision to adjust to the darkness. What gradually emerged defied comprehension. The interior was vastly larger than the cabin's exterior suggested, impossibly so. A great room stretched before him, its ceiling lost in shadows. Furniture crafted from mismatched materials hung suspended in midair, rotating slowly as if underwater. A chair made of antlers and human teeth, a table fashioned from what appeared to be petrified wood and copper. Makia reached toward a floating oil lamp, only to watch it drift away from his touch. The laws of nature had no authority here. The carved antler in his hand had grown cold again, its figures now still and facing inward, as if deliberately avoiding his gaze. He tucked it into his belt, wanting both hands free. In the room's center sat an object that drew his attention, a weathered leather journal resting atop a pedestal made of stacked animal skulls. Unlike everything else, it remained firmly in place, as if anchored to reality. Makia approached cautiously. The journal seemed ordinary enough, bound in simple leather, its pages yellowed with age. When he opened it, the handwriting inside shifted between languages and styles, as if written by many different people across time. The first entry he could understand was dated 1879. 3 days trapped in this accursed place. The door vanishes when I approach. The windows show only darkness. I fear I will never escape. Something watches from the shadows. It knows my name. He turned the page. A different handwriting, this one shakier, 1925, found this book by chance. Previous entries confirm my fears. Others have been trapped here. Some for years. The house speaks to me now, offering freedom in exchange for something I cannot give. May God forgive me for what I'm considering. Makia flipped forward, finding entries in various languages, Spanish, English, and older scripts he couldn't identify. Then he found writing in Apache, in a hand so similar to his grandfather's that he felt a chill. The prison weakens. The binding must be renewed. I was a fool to enter, thinking myself stronger than those who came before. The watcher gains strength from fear. Remember the old ways. Remember what we are. The entry was unsigned, undated. Makia stared at the familiar handwriting, wondering if his grandfather had stood in this very spot, held this same journal. Movement caught his eye, a shadow detaching itself from the wall, moving against the dim light rather than with it. It slithered across the ceiling before disappearing behind a floating bookcase. The medicine pouch against Makia's chest grew colder still, almost burning with its chill. He clutched it through his shirt, drawing comfort from the connection to his father, who dwells here. He called, his voice sounding muffled as if the air itself absorbed sound. In response, the floating furniture began to rotate faster. The shadows gathered density in the corners, pulsing like living things. And somewhere deeper in the house, something heavy dragged across the floor. Makia moved toward what appeared to be a hallway, but after 3 steps, found himself back where he started, facing the journal again. The house defied normal space. He returned to the journal, flipping to its final pages. Most were blank, but the last entry, written in a desperate scrawl, chilled him. It knows you're reading this. It watches from behind your eyes. Don't look up. Against his will, Makia looked up. The ceiling had vanished, replaced by what appeared to be a reflection of the room. Except in the reflection, he wasn't alone. A figure stood behind him, its features obscured, but its presence undeniable. He spun around. Nothing. When he looked back at the journal, a new line had appeared in fresh ink, still glistening wet. Welcome. Makia, we've been waiting. From outside, faint but distinct, came Keme's voice. Calling his name, Makia rushed to the door, yanking it open. He could see the clearing, see Keme approaching the house with a mixture of awe and horror on his face. He tried to shout a warning, but no sound escaped his lips. The space between the door and the outside world might as well have been an ocean. He was trapped, and Keme was about to make the same mistake. Makia pounded against the invisible barrier between himself and the outside world. His fists met solid resistance where there should have been none. Through this strange window, he could see Kimmy approaching the house, bow lowered, face twisted with fascination and dread. "Turn back," Makia shouted, though he could tell no sound reached the outside. He gestured frantically, trying to wave Kimmy away. The younger man continued forward, oblivious to the warnings. He called Makia's name again, the sound reaching inside the house like a distant echo. Desperate, Makia turned back to the impossible room. There had to be another way out, or at least a way to communicate. He moved quickly, searching the floating furniture for anything useful. That's when he noticed an ornate oval mirror suspended near what appeared to be a staircase that bent in impossible angles. Unlike the other floating objects, the mirror remained perfectly still, as if anchored to reality itself. The mirror's frame was carved from a material resembling bone, but darker, with symbols that matched those on the trees outside. Its glass surface didn't reflect the room around it, but showed only darkness, until Makia stepped before it. His reflection appeared, but wrong somehow. Older, wearier. The reflection's eyes held knowledge, his own did not, and its lips moved independent of his own. "You should not have come," his reflection whispered, the voice emerging from the mirror with a clarity that made Makia step back. "You opened the way for it. What is this place?" Makia demanded. "A prison." The reflection aged further as he watched, wrinkles deepening, hair whitening. "Built by our ancestors to contain what could not be destroyed." "Our ancestors?" The reflection changed, becoming not Makia but a younger man with similar features. "The responsibility was ours, has always been ours. The bloodline remembers even when the mind forgets." Realization dawned. "My grandfather was here. Many of our blood have maintained the prison." The mirror's surface rippled, showing glimpses of other faces, men and women with features similar to his own, across different eras. Some by choice, some by fate. Outside, Kemi had reached the base of the impossible house. He circled the single leg of twisted pine, examining it with disbelief. "How do I escape?" Makia asked urgently. "My nephew, there is no escape," the mirror whispered, its surface darkening. "Only succession." In the reflection, Makia now saw himself standing alongside the many faces of his ancestors. The implication chilled him to the bone. "I won't stay here," he insisted. "They all say that," the mirror replied, its voice now multiple voices speaking in unison. "Until they understand the alternative, which is." The mirror's surface swirled with darkness. "It escapes instead." The reflection shifted again, this time showing not people, but a landscape, Makia's homeland, his village. But wrong, corrupted, trees twisted into unnatural shapes, shadow figures moving among cowering people. Children with eyes too dark and smiles too wide. "This is what comes if the prison fails," the whispers explained. Outside, Keme had reached the door, his hand extended toward the handle. "My nephew is about to enter," Makia said urgently. "How do I warn him?" "You cannot." The voices in the mirror sounded almost pitying. "The house needs new blood. It always calls to more than one. I won't let it take him too. You have no power here," the mirror whispered. "Only the bloodline can command, and even then the cost is high." Makia's hand went to the medicine pouch at his chest. It pulsed with cold energy, seemingly in response to the mirror's words. "My father knew," he realized. The pouch, a temporary shield, nothing more. The mirror's surface began to frost over at the edges. "Your blood remembers what your mind has forgotten. Look deeper." Before Makia could respond, a sound came from behind, the door opening. Kem stood at the threshold, his eyes wide with wonder as he took in the impossible interior. "Uncle?" he called, stepping inside. "This isn't possible." The door swung shut behind him with the same dreadful finality Makia had experienced. The house had claimed another victim. The mirror's surface went completely black, but the whispers remained. "Now it begins." Keme moved through the impossible room, his fingers brushing against floating furniture with childlike wonder rather than fear. "This is beyond belief," he breathed, turning in a slow circle. "How is this possible?" Makia grabbed his nephew's shoulders. "We're trapped. This place, it's not what it seems." "Trapped?" Kem laughed, shaking free. Uncle, this is incredible. A miracle. The spirits truly exist. He gestured at a suspended chair that rotated in response to his movement. We'll be celebrated when we return with news of this place. We may not return, Makia said gravely, watching shadows gather in the corners. This house is a prison. For something dangerous, Kem's enthusiasm dimmed slightly. What do you mean? Before Makia could explain, a soft glow emanated from what appeared to be a side table floating near the warped staircase. Atop it sat an object Makia hadn't noticed before, an ornate brass compass with symbols etched around its edges. Keme approached it first, natural curiosity overriding caution. Look at this craftsmanship. Don't touch anything, Makia warned, but too late. Keme lifted the compass, examining it with appreciation. The needle spun wildly at first, then stopped, pointing directly at Kim. Strange. It doesn't point north. Makia moved closer. Let me see. When he took the compass, the needle immediately shifted, now pointing at Makia instead. Something about its unwavering focus unsettled him deeply. It points at whoever holds it, Keme observed. Makia shook his head. No, I think it points at what we fear. As if confirming his words, the area behind Makia darkened. A shape formed in the shadows, the silhouette of a withered elder, reminiscent of his father. The figure reached with gnarled hands, mouth opening to speak words Makia had heard too many times. You abandoned the old ways, failed your duty, failed your blood. Makia stepped back, heart pounding. The shadow dissipated. What did you see? Gib masked, eyes wide. Nothing, Makia lied. Returning the compass, the needle swung back to Kimi, and now the shadows behind the younger man coalesced into a different shape. A wounded deer, struggling to stand, eyes full of accusation. Keme had confessed once, drunk on ceremonial wine, to wounding a buck as a boy and failing to track it, leaving it to suffer a slow death. Keme paled, backing away until the vision faded. It knows, he whispered. How can it know? The mirror spoke of blood memory, Makia said, thinking aloud. Perhaps this place reads what's within us. Mirror? Kem looked around frantically. What mirror? Makia turned toward where the whispering mirror had been, but it was gone, the wall now blank. This house. Changes, he explained, the compass heavy in his hand. Things appear and disappear. Space itself doesn't work normally. He pointed to the journal on its pedestal. That book contains writings from others who were trapped here. Some from our own family. Kemi's expression shifted from wonder to dawning horror. You're serious? We're truly trapped. I've tried to leave. There's some kind of barrier. The compass needle began to spin again, faster and faster, until it blurred into a circle. The brass housing grew warm, then hot in Makia's palm. Suddenly the needle stopped, now pointing toward a doorway that hadn't existed moments before. Unlike the impossible angles of the warped staircase, this passage appeared almost normal, a simple wooden doorframe leading to a corridor. It's showing us a way, Keme said. Hope returning. Maybe a way out, Makia wasn't so sure. Or leading us deeper. What choice do we have? Keme gestured around the room. Stay here. The younger man had a point. Makia tucked the compass into his belt alongside the carved antler. Stay close to me. Touch nothing else. As they approached the doorway, the shadows around them seemed to retreat, gathering at the edges of their vision like spectators. The corridor beyond was narrow, walls lined with framed photographs that changed as they passed. Makia glimpsed his daughter Ayana in one image, then his father, then people he didn't recognize, but who shared familiar features. Ancestors, perhaps. The pictures, Keme whispered. They're watching us, Makia nodded grimly. The whole house watches. The compass at his belt grew warmer, vibrating slightly as if excited. The needle remained fixed on their path forward despite the turns in the corridor. Uncle, Keme said quietly after several minutes of walking. If this is truly a prison, as you say, then what is it imprisoning? As if in answer, a low sound echoed from somewhere deep within the house. Not quite a growl, not quite a voice, but something between the two. The floorboards beneath their feet trembled. I think, Makia replied, hand instinctively moving to the medicine pouch at his chest. We're being taken to find out. The corridor ended abruptly at a circular room filled with clocks, dozens of them covering every surface. Grandfather clocks, cuckoo clocks, pocket watches suspended in mid-air, each showed a different time, their ticking creating a discordant symphony that made Machia's teeth ache. At the room's center stood the largest timepiece, an ornate grandfather clock with a pendulum that swung in defiance of rhythm. Its face featured no numbers, only strange symbols that matched those on the trees outside. The hands moved backwards, then forwards, then in circles. "Don't approach that," Machia warned. But Keme had already stepped toward the central clock. Drawn by its hypnotic motion, "The craftsmanship is remarkable," Keme murmured, reaching toward the clock's face. "I've never seen anything—" "Keme, no! Too late!" Keme's fingers brushed the clock's surface. Time shattered around them. Keme froze mid-gesture, then his skin began to change, wrinkles forming around his eyes, grey streaking through his hair. In seconds he aged years before Machia's horrified gaze. "Uncle?" Gem's voice had acquired the rasp of age. He staggered back, staring at his weathered hands in horror. "What's happening to me?" Machia lunged forward, grabbing Keme and pulling him away from the clock. The aging slowed but didn't reverse. Gim now appeared 20 years older, hair salted with grey, face lined with wrinkles that hadn't existed minutes before. "It feeds on time," Machia realized aloud. The journal had mentioned something similar, entries spanning decades written by people who claimed to have been trapped for only days. The central clock's ticking grew louder, more insistent. Its pendulum swung faster, and the hands spun with increasing speed. The other timepieces responded, their ticking synchronizing until the room pulsed with sound. "We need to leave," Machia urged, pulling Keme toward the room's only other exit, a narrow doorway that seemed to lead deeper into the house. As they moved away from the hungry clock, Keme touched his face, feeling the new wrinkles. "It stole my years," he whispered. "Will I keep aging?" "I don't know," Machia admitted. He examined his nephew closely. The aging seemed to have stopped, leaving Keme looking approximately 50, ironically close to Machia's own age now. "How do you feel?" "Tired. Joints ache." Keme straightened with visible effort. "But I can continue." The compass at Machia's belt had gone cold, its needle now spinning aimlessly. Whatever guidance it had offered was gone. He removed the journal entry from his pocket, the one with his grandfather's handwriting. "The watcher gains strength from fear," he read again. "Remember the old ways." "What does that mean?" Keme asked, his newly aged face creased with worry. "I'm not sure. But the mirror said this place was built by our ancestors. A prison." Machia gestured at their surroundings. "This clock. Perhaps it's how the prisoner is kept weak." By feeding it measured time instead of freedom. Beyond the clockroom, they found themselves in a corridor that spiraled downward. Unlike the previous passageways, this one was carved from stone, with roots breaking through the ceiling and walls. Real roots, not supernatural manifestations. "We're going beneath the house," Keme observed. "But how can that be?" "The house stands on a single leg." Machia had no answer. The laws of nature meant nothing here. As they descended, the air grew colder. The carved antler at Machia's belt vibrated, and the medicine pouch at his chest pulsed with cold energy that now felt almost protective rather than warning. They reached a landing where the spiral split into 3 separate passages. Each looked identical, dark stone tunnels leading into shadow. "Which way?" Gem asked, his new voice still strange to Machia's ears. Before Machia could respond, a whisper echoed from the leftmost tunnel. "This way to freedom. From the center, this way to truth. From the right, this way to power." Keme took a step toward the left passage. "If one offers freedom," Machia caught his arm. "It's testing us, tempting us." He recalled the mirror's words. "Only the bloodline can command." On impulse, Machia removed the medicine pouch and held it before him. "Show us the way to the heart of the prison," he demanded. The pouch grew ice-cold, nearly burning his palm. Then a soft blue light emanated from within it, illuminating the center passage. "Truth," Machia said softly. "Not freedom. Not power. How did you know?" Keme asked. Makya returned the pouch to his neck. I didn't, but my father did. They entered the center passage together. As they walked, the stone walls gave way to older materials. First timber, then packed earth, finally what appeared to be bone. I feel it watching us, Kemi whispered. Makya nodded. It's been watching since we entered the forest. The passage widened into a chamber, and they stopped at its threshold, stunned by what lay within. The chamber was a perfect circle, its walls consisting of smooth, dark stone, unlike anything Makya had seen. Symbols were carved into every surface, thousands of them, glowing with faint blue light, similar to what had emanated from the medicine pouch. In the center of the chamber stood a stone pedestal. Resting upon it was a circular object, approximately the size of a man's palm, a disk of black stone with a hole in its center, covered in intricate carvings that seemed to shift when viewed directly. What is this place? Kem whispered, his newly aged voice echoing strangely. The center, Makya replied, approaching the pedestal cautiously. The heart of the prison. The stone disk called to him somehow, a silent summons he felt in his blood rather than heard. When he extended his hand toward it, the carvings on the walls pulsed brighter. Careful. Uncle, Kemi warned. Makya hesitated, then steeled himself and picked up the disk. The moment his fingers touched the stone, visions flooded his mind, not like memories, but something older, deeper. Knowledge carved into his bloodline before birth. He saw his ancestors, hundreds of generations back, confronting something ancient and terrible that had emerged from a tear between worlds. A being of shadow and hunger that fed on fear and despair. Too powerful to destroy, it could only be contained. The wisest among them devised a prison, not of physical walls, but of binding magic anchored to a single bloodline who would serve as eternal wardens. The house was merely the shell, the physical manifestation of a metaphysical cage. The vision shifted, showing generations of his family maintaining the prison. Some lived normal lives, only visiting to strengthen the bindings. Others were forced to remain as active wardens when the prisoner grew too strong, sacrificing their freedom to protect the world outside. Makya saw his grandfather enter the house voluntarily, understanding what it would cost him. Saw him age decades in what felt like moments as he renewed the binding with his blood and life force. The stone disk, the binding stone, was the key to it all. The physical anchor for the spiritual prison. Makya gasped as the vision released him, nearly dropping the disk. I understand now, he whispered. What did you see? Kemi asked, reaching for his arm to steady him. But as Kemi's fingers touched his skin, Makya felt a wrongness, a cold that had nothing to do with the supernatural chill of the chamber. He jerked away, staring at his nephew with new understanding. You're not Kemi. The man who looked like his nephew smiled, an expression that never reached his eyes. Not entirely, no. His voice had changed, layers of other voices beneath Kemi's. Not anymore. The entity, Makya realized, heart sinking. You've possessed him, influenced, the thing wearing Kemi's face corrected. Guided, your blood is immune to full possession, another clever trick of your ancestors. But his blood is adjacent enough to be useful. Makya clutched the binding stone tighter, feeling its power resonating with the medicine pouch at his chest. Since when? Since he touched the clock. Time creates openings. Not Kemi circled the chamber, trailing fingers across the glowing symbols. He was so afraid of aging, of becoming useless. Fear makes such convenient doorways. Release him, Makya demanded. The thing laughed with Kemi's mouth. I cannot, and soon I will not need this vessel at all. It gestured at the binding stone. You've brought me exactly what I needed, the key to my prison, carried by one of the bloodline. Horror washed over Makya as he realized his mistake. The compass, the corridors, they were leading us here deliberately, of course. Did you think you found this chamber by accident? That your pitiful medicine pouch truly guided you? Not Kemi's smile widened unnaturally. I've waited centuries for one of the blood to return and bring the binding stone directly to me. Why not just take it yourself? Why need me at all? Because only the bloodline can touch it. Only the bloodline can use it. The thing in Kemi's body stepped closer. To bind or to unbind? Makia backed away, mind racing. The drought, the game, fleeing, his father's warnings, all signs that the prison was already weakening. If the entity escaped completely, the binding must be renewed, Makia said, remembering his grandfather's words in the journal. That's why my grandfather came. And now you have come, not Kemi agreed. But you will make a different choice. You will free me. Never. No? The thing wearing his nephew's face tilted its head. Then I will keep this body and many others from your village. Starting with your daughter, perhaps. Sweet Ayana with her modern ideas and secret fears. Rage flooded Makia. He lunged forward, the binding stone glowing blue in his hand. You will not touch her. The entity raised Kemi's hands defensively, but too late. The binding stone made contact with his chest, and both man and entity screamed in agony. Kemi collapsed, convulsing as shadow poured from his mouth and eyes. Coalescing in the center of the chamber, a writhing mass of darkness trying to form a shape. The binding stone burned cold in Makia's hand, pulling him toward the shadow like a magnet to iron. In that moment, Makia understood his true purpose in coming here. Not to hunt, not to feed his people, but to fulfill the duty his blood had always been destined for, to become the new warden of the prison. The shadow entity roiled in the center of the chamber, formless, yet somehow vast. It stretched tendrils toward the ceiling and walls, testing the boundaries of its confinement. Each time it touched one of the glowing symbols, the blue light flared defensively, pushing it back. Kemi lay unconscious, his breathing shallow but steady. The unnatural aging remained, his hair still gray, face still lined, but the malevolent presence had gone from his features. Makia knelt beside his nephew, checking his pulse while keeping the binding stone firmly in his grip. Kemi, can you hear me? The younger man's eyes fluttered open, clear of the entity's influence. Uncle, he whispered. What happened? I remember the clock and then shadows inside my mind. Rest, Makia instructed, helping him sit up against the chamber wall. It's gone from you now. Not gone, Kemi corrected weakly, pointing at the writhing darkness. Just outside instead of inside, the shadows coalesced, becoming more concentrated. Vague features formed in the mass, suggestions of eyes, a mouth, limbs that never quite solidified. Warden, it hissed, its voice seeming to come from everywhere at once. New warden of old blood. Makia stood, positioning himself between the entity and Kemi. I am not your warden yet, but you will be. The shadows rippled with what might have been laughter. Or everything you love will perish. The binding stone pulsed in Makia's hand, resonating with the symbols on the walls. Knowledge continued to flood into him, understanding of what must be done to renew the binding, to strengthen the prison, a sacrifice of blood, a sacrifice of time, a sacrifice of freedom. He needed to find the final pieces of the ritual. According to the knowledge flowing from the stone, there should be tools hidden within the house, objects his ancestors had created specifically for the renewal ceremony. I need to find something, he told Kem, not taking his eyes off the shadow entity. Can you stand? Kem nodded, struggling to his feet with a grimace. My body feels old. It is old, Makia replied grimly. The clock took your years. I'm sorry, not your fault, Kemi assured him, steadying himself against the wall. What are we looking for? Makia concentrated on the knowledge from the binding stone. There should be a flute somewhere in the house, made from human bone and strung with something I don't want to contemplate. It's needed for the ritual. The shadow entity writhed more violently at the mention of the flute. The song weakens me, it snarled. The song binds me. Then we definitely need to find it, Kemi said with newfound determination. Makia nodded. The binding is weakening. That's why the drought came to our lands, why the game fled. Its influence is already leaking into our world. How do we find this flute? Makia held up the binding stone, which emitted a soft blue pulse. This will guide us. As if in response, a narrow opening appeared in the chamber wall, a passage that hadn't existed moments before. The house responds to the stone, Makya realized. To the warden's will, the shadow entity lunged suddenly, tendrils of darkness stretching toward the opening. The symbols on the walls flared brighter, forcing it back. It's still partially contained, Makya observed, but growing stronger. We need to hurry. They moved toward the new passage, Makya leading with the binding stone held before him like a talisman. The blue glow illuminated their way through a narrow tunnel that curved gently upward. What happens if we renew the binding? Geme asked as they walked. Makya hesitated, then decided his nephew deserved the truth. Someone must remain as warden, to maintain the prison. You, Kem said, understanding immediately. Makya nodded, the weight of his destiny settling on his shoulders. It's why I was drawn here, why my father gave me the medicine pouch. He knew. There must be another way, Kemi insisted. If there is, we'll find it, Makya replied, not believing his own words. The passage opened into a small circular room, dominated by a stone pedestal similar to the one in the binding chamber. Resting upon it was an object that made both men stop in their tracks, a flute carved from what was unmistakably human bone, polished to an ivory sheen. Intricate symbols matching those in the binding chamber were etched along its length. Instead of finger holes, it featured small gaps, where the bone had been carefully split and rejoined with what looked like sinew and silver wire. The binding stone pulsed more rapidly in Makya's hand, responding to the flute's presence. Is that... Kemi couldn't finish the sentence. Yes. Makya approached the pedestal slowly. The ancestral flute, part of the binding ritual. He reached for the instrument, then hesitated. In the vision, I saw my grandfather play this. The song calmed the entity, weakened it enough for the binding to be renewed. Do you know the song? Kem asked. Makya shook his head, not consciously. But perhaps he touched the flute with his free hand. Like the binding stone, it felt cold against his skin. The moment his fingers closed around it, a melody surfaced in his mind, complex, haunting, with patterns that seemed to fold in on themselves, like the impossible angles of the house. I can hear it, he whispered in wonder. The blood remembers. From somewhere deep in the house, a howl of rage echoed, the entity sensing another piece of its prison being reclaimed. The walls around them shuddered, and the doorway through which they had entered began to shrink. The house attempting to trap them. We need to move, Makya said urgently, tucking the flute into his belt alongside the carved antler. The entity fights against us now. With the binding stone lighting their way, they raced for the narrowing exit, squeezing through just before it sealed completely behind them. The house was changing around them, corridors shifting and rooms rearranging themselves. What had been a passage upward now twisted sideways, gravity itself seeming to reorient. Yet Makya moved with growing confidence, the binding stone guiding him through the impossible geometry. The entity is trying to separate us from the binding chamber, he explained, as walls groaned and floors rippled. It knows what we intend. Keme followed closely, his movements hampered by his artificially aged body. What else do we need for the ritual? Makya consulted the knowledge flowing from the binding stone. One more item. A quill or pen of some kind used to sign the binding contract. A contract with what? The entity? No, with the prison itself. Makya ducked as a section of ceiling descended suddenly, nearly crushing them. The warden becomes part of the binding, neither fully inside nor outside. They emerged into a long gallery where portraits lined the walls. Unlike the photographs from earlier, these were oil paintings spanning centuries of styles. Each depicted a solemn figure with features similar to Makya's own, men and women of his bloodline who had served as wardens. At the gallery's end sat a small writing desk. Atop it rested a single feather quill, black as midnight and gleaming with unnatural luster. Even from a distance, Makya could sense its significance. That's it, he said, approaching cautiously. The quill was like no feather he had ever seen, too large for any natural bird, its vein patterned with symbols that matched those on the binding stone. The nib was not metal, but something crystalline that caught the light strangely. Blood quill, Makya whispered, the name surfacing from his inherited memories. Keme hung back. It requires blood to write, doesn't it? Makya nodded grimly. The binding must be signed and sealed with the warden's blood. As he reached for the quill, the entire gallery shuddered. Portraits fell from walls, glass shattering. The writing desk began to sink into the floor, the house attempting to hide the quill from them. Makya lunged forward, grasping the quill just as the desk disappeared completely. The moment his fingers closed around it, pain shot through his hand, the crystalline nib drawing blood, even from that light touch. A drop of his blood touched the quill's surface and was absorbed instantly. The feather pulsed once with red light, then settled, now linked to him. "It's done," he said, showing Kemi his pricked finger. "The quill has tasted my blood. It will work for the ritual now." From distant parts of the house came sounds of destruction, furniture splintering, walls collapsing. The entity's rage manifested in the physical structure. "We need to get back to the binding chamber," Makya said urgently, "before it can stop us. Do you know the way?" Kemi asked, steadying himself against a wall as the floor tilted. Makya held up the binding stone, which pulsed blue in a specific direction. "This will lead us. Stay close." They navigated the shifting labyrinth, the house actively working against them now. Stairways crumbled as they descended. Doors sealed shut before they could reach them. Yet the binding stone always revealed another route, as if the oldest magic of the prison still recognized and responded to the bloodline. "The entity is getting desperate," Makya observed as they squeezed through a narrow gap where a wall had failed to close completely. "Why not just attack us directly?" Gem wondered, panting from exertion. "It's still partially bound, limited." Makya helped his nephew over a section of collapsed flooring, but growing stronger by the minute. They rounded a corner and found themselves facing the whispering mirror from earlier, now floating in the middle of a corridor that should have led to the binding chamber. "Wrong turn?" Gem asked. "No. It's blocking our path." The mirror's surface swirled with darkness, and the entity's voice emerged from it. "Last chance, Warden. Turn back. Leave this place." "I will spare your village." "You lie," Makya replied steadily. "You would consume everything once free." "Not everything. Not at once." The darkness in the mirror shaped itself into an approximation of a face. "I could grant your people decades before turning to them. Time enough for your daughter to live a full life." Makya faltered, the mention of Ayana striking a vulnerable chord. The entity sensed his hesitation. "She need never know hunger again. Your people would prosper under my shadow." "At what cost?" Makya demanded. "Others, not your blood, not your concern." The temptation clawed at him. Freedom for himself, security for his family and tribe. All it would cost was his honor and the lives of strangers. Keme's hand gripped his shoulder. "It offers poison coated in honey," his nephew said firmly. "Remember who you are." Makya straightened, resolve returning. He raised the binding stone toward the mirror. "I am the warden. This prison is my duty." The mirror shattered with a shriek of rage, shards dissolving into shadow before they could reach the men. The corridor ahead was clear again, leading downward toward the binding chamber. "Thank you," Makya told Kemi quietly. His nephew nodded. "Now let's finish this." They descended the final passage, the binding stone glowing brighter with each step. Makya carried all three ritual components now, the stone, the flute, and the blood quill. Everything needed to renew the binding. Everything needed to sacrifice his freedom forever. The binding chamber had transformed in their absence. The walls still glowed with ancient symbols, but many had dimmed or flickered erratically. The shadow entity now occupied the center of the room, larger and more defined than before. It had begun to take shape, a towering figure with too many limbs and a face that seemed to shift between human and animal features. "You're too late, Warden," it hissed, voice reverberating through the chamber. "The old binding fails. Can you not feel it?" Makya could indeed feel it. The binding stone pulsed urgently in his hand, its blue light fluctuating. The knowledge flowing From it now came in disjointed fragments rather than steady revelation. "Keme, stay by the entrance," Makya instructed, stepping forward alone. "If something happens to me, take the stone and run. Get it to my father." His nephew nodded reluctantly, positioning himself near the passage they had entered through. Makya approached the entity the binding stone held before him. "I've come to renew the binding," the shadow laughed, the sound causing the walls to vibrate. "With what knowledge? The binding ritual requires the true name. Without it, your tools are useless." True name. The term resonated within Makya, triggering another fragment of inherited memory. Each entity had a true name, a word of power that gave control over it. His ancestors had discovered this one's name and used it as the cornerstone of the binding spell. But that name was nowhere in the knowledge that had flowed to him. The entity sensed his uncertainty. "See? Even your blood has forgotten. Generations pass, memory fades." It expanded, reaching tendrils toward the ceiling. "Soon I will be free to feed again." Makya's mind raced. Where would his ancestors have hidden something so crucial? Not in the binding stone itself, clearly. Too risky if it ever fell into the wrong hands. He looked at the other ritual components. The flute, the quill, neither seemed like a secure repository for such dangerous knowledge. Then his gaze fell on the journal that had appeared on a pedestal near the wall, the same journal he had found when first entering the house. Of course, hidden in plain sight, passed from warden to warden. "The journal," he said aloud. The entity recoiled slightly, confirming his suspicion. Makya moved toward the pedestal, but shadow tentacles lashed out, blocking his path. "Stay back!" the entity snarled. "Keme!" Makya called. "The book! I need it!" His nephew darted forward, managing to skirt the distracted entity and grab the journal from its pedestal. He tossed it to Makya just as shadow tentacles swept him off his feet, flinging him against the far wall. "Keme!" Makya cried out, seeing his nephew slump to the ground. "Attend to your ritual, warden," the entity mocked. "Your companion will be the first of many I consume when free." Rage and fear threatened to overwhelm Makya, but he forced himself to focus. Kemi was still breathing. He could see the rise and fall of his chest. There was still time. Clutching the journal, he flipped through it frantically, searching for any sign of the true name. The pages seemed to blur, text shifting languages and handwriting styles with each turn. Then he saw it. A page where every entry, regardless of language or time period, contained the same symbol subtly worked into the text. Not a letter or character in any human alphabet, but something more fundamental, a shape that seemed to exist in the space between what the eye could process. Concentrating on that shape made Makya's head hurt, but he forced himself to focus, to let his blood remember. The symbol began to resolve itself in his mind, taking on sound and meaning. The true name. He couldn't speak it, wouldn't dare until the ritual was properly prepared. But now he knew. The entity sensed the change in him. "What have you found, Warden?" it demanded, suddenly uncertain. Makya closed the journal. "What I needed." He placed it carefully on the ground, then retrieved the flute from his belt. "Shall we begin?" The entity lunged toward him, but the binding stone flared in Makya's hand, pushing the shadows back. He raised the flute to his lips, fingers finding positions he had never learned yet somehow knew perfectly. The melody that emerged was unlike anything Makya had ever played or heard, notes that seemed to exist in the spaces between traditional tones, rhythms that followed patterns both mathematical and organic. The song of binding, remembered by his blood. As he played, the entity writhed in apparent pain, its form becoming less defined, more diffuse. The symbols on the walls brightened in response to the music, their light containing the thrashing shadows. "No!" it shrieked between notes. "I will not be caged again!" The entity gathered itself and launched a desperate attack, shadow tendrils whipping toward Makya from all directions. The binding stone's protective aura wavered under the assault. Makya maintained the song, though one tendril slipped through, slashing across his cheek. Pain lanced through him, but he didn't falter, the melody continuing without break. Blood from the cut trickled down his face, dropping onto the flute. Where it touched, the bone instrument absorbed it eagerly, glowing red with power. The entity howled in fury and fear as the flute's music intensified, forcing it toward the center of the chamber, compressing its form into a tighter space. "This changes nothing," it raged. "Even if you bind me today, the prison weakens with each generation. Eventually, there will be no wardens left, and I will be free forever." Makia lowered the flute, keeping the binding stone raised. "Not today," he said calmly, and spoke the true name. The true name tore from Makia's lips, a sound both ancient and impossible, more felt than heard. The chamber resonated with its power, every symbol on the walls flaring to blinding intensity. The entity convulsed, shadows compressing further, as if the name itself were a physical force crushing it inward. "No!" it shrieked, its many voices fragmented with pain. "Not again!" Makia advanced, binding stone raised high. "By the blood of the first warden I command you," he intoned, words coming from memory older than himself. "By the covenant of binding, I contain you." The chamber floor shifted, stone flowing like water to create a circular depression in the center. The entity fought desperately against the compression, shadow tendrils lashing out in all directions. One tendril slashed across Makia's arm, drawing blood. Another struck the binding stone, sending cracks spreading across its surface. The blue light wavered, dimming momentarily. Makia stumbled, the ritual faltering. The entity surged immediately, expanding outward. "The stone breaks!" it crowed triumphantly. "The binding fails!" From the chamber entrance, Keme called weakly, "The knife, uncle! Use the sacrificial knife!" Makia's eyes snapped to his nephew, who had regained consciousness and was pointing to a corner of the chamber where the shadows seemed to part reluctantly. There, gleaming on a small pedestal that hadn't been visible before, lay a ceremonial knife similar to his hunting blade, but clearly much older. The knife's handle was carved from the same dark bone as the flute, its blade forged from a silvery metal that caught the light of the symbols. Ancient glyphs decorated both blade and hilt, power radiating from them even at a distance. Makia lunged for it, dodging shadow tendrils. His fingers closed around the handle just as the entity realized what he intended. "No!" it screamed. "Not! Your blood! I will not be bound again!" The knife seemed to come alive in Makia's grip, vibrating with eagerness. Unlike the blood quill, which had merely sampled his blood, this blade demanded more, a true sacrifice to power the binding. Makia understood with sudden clarity. The binding stone was never meant to last forever. Each renewal required a fresh anchor. The knowledge flowed from the knife now, the final piece of the ritual. "With blood freely given I seal thee," Makia declared, drawing the blade across his palm. Blood welled immediately, impossibly copious from such a small cut. The entity threw itself against the invisible constraints of the true name, fighting with renewed desperation. "I will take your daughter," it threatened. "Your father, your entire tribe, their suffering will be eternal." Makia ignored the threats, letting his blood pool in his cupped palm. He spoke the true name again, adding, "Blood of the warden binds thee. Time of the warden contains thee. Freedom of the warden imprisons thee." He thrust his bloodied hand toward the compressed shadow, feeling an impossible pull as the entity and the ritual itself drew from him. Not just blood, but something deeper. Years of his life, fragments of his freedom, pieces of his very self. The pain was beyond anything Makia had experienced, a tearing sensation that started in his flesh and reached to his soul. He screamed but maintained the connection, refusing to break the ritual, even as he felt decades being stripped from him. His hair whitened, skin wrinkled, Joints ached with sudden arthritis, yet still he held firm, forcing his life force into the binding. The cracked binding stone dissolved completely, its power transferring to Machia's blood. Where the blood touched, the shadow entity, new bindings formed. Chains of blue light that wrapped around the darkness, constricting it further. "I name thee prisoner," Machia gasped, feeling twice his age, the sacrificial knife still gripped in his withered hand. "I bind thee to this house. I become thy warden until my blood names another." With his remaining strength, Machia plunged the knife downward, driving it into the stone floor at the exact center of the circular depression. His blood ran down the blade, seeping into the stone, which began to glow with the same blue light as the symbols on the walls. The entity gave one final, terrible shriek as it collapsed entirely, compressed into a sphere of pure darkness, no larger than Machia's fist. The sphere sank into the floor where the knife had pierced it, disappearing from sight as the stone flowed back to seal the opening. The sacrificial knife remained embedded in the floor, its handle protruding like a marker over the entity's prison within a prison. Silence fell. The violent shaking of the chamber subsided. The symbols on the walls dimmed to a steady, sustainable glow. Machia collapsed to his knees, his body now resembling that of an 80-year-old man. The ritual had taken 30 years from him in moments, the price of renewing the binding. "Uncle!" Gim crawled to his side, supporting him. "What have you done?" Machia looked at his nephew with eyes that now held centuries of inherited memory fully unlocked. "What I was born to do," he whispered. "What our blood has always done." The chamber around them began to change, reconfiguring itself. The prison was recognizing its new warden. Dawn light filtered through windows that hadn't existed hours before. The binding chamber had transformed into something resembling living quarters, simple but functional. A bed, a table, shelves lined with books both ancient and new. The walls still bore the faintly glowing symbols of containment, but they had receded into the background, a constant reminder rather than an active force. In the center of the room, the sacrificial knife remained embedded in the floor, its handle now merged with a column of wood that extended upward to the ceiling, the house's single leg, passing directly through its heart. Machia sat on the edge of the bed, examining his aged hands. The skin was thin, liver-spotted, veins prominent beneath the surface. His hair, now completely white, fell in front of his eyes as he leaned forward. "The house has accepted you," Keme observed, standing by one of the new windows that looked out onto the forest clearing. "It's stable now," Machia nodded. "The binding is renewed. The prison recognizes its warden." He rose stiffly, joints protesting the movement. "The entity is contained again, though it will never stop trying to free itself." The column in the room's center pulsed briefly with blue light, as if acknowledging his words. Machia approached it, placing his palm against the wood. Through it, he could sense the imprisoned entity, dormant for now, but still present. "Always present. This leg is the true anchor," he explained. "The physical manifestation of the binding that holds everything together. My blood, my years, my freedom, all woven into its structure now." Keme looked troubled. "You can't stay here, Uncle. Our people need you. I must stay." Machia turned to his nephew with sad certainty. "That's the final part of the binding. The warden becomes the living lock on the prison door. If I leave, the binding weakens. For how long? Until another of the bloodline takes my place." Machia's gaze grew distant. "Or until I die with no successor, and the prison begins to fail again." Keme approached, placing a hand on his uncle's shoulder. "There must be some way." "There isn't," Machia interrupted gently. "This is the covenant our ancestors made, the price they agreed to pay to protect the world from what they couldn't destroy." The timberleg pulsed again, brighter this time. Through his connection to it, Machia sensed something stirring in the forest outside. "Someone approaches," he said, moving to the window. Through the trees, a figure appeared, a hunter moving cautiously toward the impossible house. Even at a distance, Machia recognized his daughter Ayana's distinctive gait. "She's looking for us," Keme said. We've been gone 5 days. 5 days. Makia's brow furrowed. It feels like hours. Time moves differently here, Kemi replied. I felt it while you performed the ritual. Ayana emerged from the tree line, stopping at the sight of the house balanced on its single leg. Her modern rifle lowered in shock, free hand moving to her mouth. She can't enter, Makia said firmly. The house has claimed enough of our family. She'll want to see you, to understand. Makia's heart ached at the truth of this. Go to her. Explain what you can. Tell her, he faltered. Tell her I have found my purpose. That I serve our people in the oldest way, Keme hesitated. Will I be able to return? To visit you? Yes, the house will recognize you now. But it's dangerous. The entity will always try to use visitors, to manipulate them. Makia gripped his nephew's arm. Promise you'll be careful. And promise you'll prepare Ayana's son when the time comes. The bloodline must continue the vigil. I promise, Kemi said solemnly. Makia moved to a small chest that had appeared beside the bed, opening it to reveal supplies, practical items for his new life. Among them lay a fresh piece of timber, perfectly straight and about 2 feet long, carved with symbols matching those on the walls. Take this, Makia said, handing the timber to Keme. Plant it at the boundary of our hunting grounds. It will warn away strangers and protect our people from the entity's influence. Keme accepted the timber reverently. How will I explain your absence? Tell them I remain to guard an ancient evil. It's truth enough. Makia managed a small smile. And tell my father he was right about everything. The house shuddered slightly, a door appearing in the wall nearest Ayana's position outside. Go now, Makia urged. Before she tries to enter herself. Keme embraced his uncle one last time, then moved to the door. He paused at the threshold, looking back at the aged man who had entered the forest in his prime just days ago. You are the bravest man I have ever known, uncle. Makia shook his head. Not brave, just born to a duty I finally understand. After Keme departed, Makia watched through the window as his nephew intercepted Ayana before she could approach the house. He saw her shock, her denial, her eventual collapse into Keme's arms as understanding dawned. He placed his palm on the glass. Very well he knew she couldn't see or feel. The warden's vigil begins, he whispered to the house, to himself, to the entity imprisoned below. The timber leg pulsed in acknowledgement, resonating with his blood. Weeks passed, though time flowed strangely within the house. Sometimes a day seemed to stretch for a week. With the times, Makia would blink and notice the moon had completed its cycle outside his window. He developed routines to maintain his sanity. Each morning, he checked the binding symbols throughout the house, touching those that dimmed to reinforce them with his presence. He read the journals of previous wardens, learning from their experiences. And he practiced with his newfound abilities, the connection to the house that allowed him to reshape rooms or create passages with a focused thought. On this particular morning, Makia sat cross-legged before the central timber leg, meditating as he had learned to do from the writings of a warden from the 1800s. Through the connection, he could sense the entity below, dormant but dreaming dark dreams that occasionally brushed against his consciousness like cold fingers. As he rose from meditation, he noticed something on his right palm that hadn't been there before, a symbol matching the central binding glyph from the chamber walls, now etched into his skin like a brand. The warden's mark, just as the journals had described. He examined it curiously. The mark didn't hurt, but pulsed gently with the same blue light as the binding symbols. When he placed it against the timber leg, the connection to the house strengthened dramatically. Rooms beyond his immediate space coming into sharper focus in his mind, the entity's prison appearing as a dark sphere suspended beneath the floor. A new power, but also a deeper binding. The house claiming more of him. Makia flexed his hand, watching the mark shimmer. According to the journals, each warden developed the mark differently. For some appearing within days, for others taking years. Its arrival signified the house's complete acceptance of its new guardian. He was truly the warden now, in body and spirit, moving to the small writing desk that had appeared in his quarters. Makia began a new entry in the journal that had guided him. Future wardens would need his knowledge just as he had needed his predecessors. The mark appeared today, he wrote. With it comes greater control over the house and stronger awareness of the prisoner. I can feel its dreams now, hungry dreams of freedom and revenge. Most often, it dreams of Ayana using my own memories against me. I must be vigilant against such manipulations. He paused, quill hovering over the page. The blood quill had transformed since the ritual, becoming an ordinary writing implement that required ink rather than blood. Small mercies. The timber warning posts Kemi placed at the boundaries appear to be working, he continued. No strangers have approached. The house shows me glimpses of the forest, and the game has begun returning. The entity's influence recedes from the land. A soft chiming interrupted his writing, the house's way of alerting him to a visitor. Through the warden's mark, he sensed Kame approaching through the forest, alone. Makia moved to the window, watching his nephew emerge from the trees. He looked well, his prematurely aged body adapting to its new limitations. He carried a bundle wrapped in deerskin, supplies perhaps, or news from the village. With a thought, Makia created a door and went to meet him at the clearing's edge. The house allowed him this much freedom, to step just beyond its walls. Though he could feel the binding stretch uncomfortably when he did. "Nephew," he greeted warmly. Keme smiled, the expression creasing his weathered face. "Uncle, you look well." It was a kind falsehood. Makia knew he appeared even older than when Keme had left, his body continuing to age rapidly as the binding drew more from him. But his eyes were clear, his mind sharp. "The house accepts me," he said, holding up his palm to show the warden's mark. "And you, the people? We survive. The drought breaks. Game returns to our traditional grounds." Kemi hesitated. "Ayana struggles with your absence, but she understands more than she admits. Her son asks about his grandfather who guards the old magic." Makia's heart ached at the mention of his grandson, a boy of 7 he might never see again. "And my father? He sends this." Keme unwrapped the bundle, revealing a medicine pouch similar to the one Makia had worn, but larger, filled with sacred herbs and objects. "He says the old warden always recognized the new, that he has been preparing this for you since your birth." Makia accepted the pouch reverently. "He knew?" "He says all medicine men know the secret, that they prepare each generation, hoping the duty will never come but ready if it does." Keme glanced at the impossible house. "He asks if you would permit him one visit before his time ends." The request struck Makia deeply, his father acknowledging and accepting his son's sacrifice. "Coming to see him in this strange prison, the house would welcome him," he said finally. "As would I." Behind him, the timber leg of the house pulsed with blue light, as if confirming his words. The warden's mark on his palm echoed the pulse. "Tell him to come at the next full moon," Makia instructed. "The binding is strongest then. The prisoner weakest," Keme nodded, then hesitated. "Uncle, are you truly at peace with this fate?" Makia considered the question seriously. "Not peace, perhaps, but purpose, understanding." He touched the warden's mark with his opposite thumb. "I was always meant for this duty, as was my grandfather before me. As may be your great-nephew someday." The house creaked behind him, a reminder of his tether. "I must return inside," he said, feeling the bindings pull. "But I am glad you came, Keme. The warden's path is solitary, but not necessarily alone." Seasons changed, leaves falling and growing anew outside Makia's windows. Inside, time continued its peculiar flow, stretching and contracting according to laws only the house understood. On this clear autumn morning, Makia worked at the edge of the clearing, his gnarled hands carving intricate symbols into a wooden post. 5 similar posts already stood at strategic points around the house, creating a perimeter of protection. These warning totems served dual purposes, keeping curious strangers away while containing any residual influence from the entity. His skill with the totems had improved over time. The first ones had been crude, effective but simple. These newer versions incorporated knowledge gleaned from the journals of previous wardens and his own growing understanding of the binding magic. Makya drove the completed totem into the ground, feeling the familiar pull as he neared the limit of his tether to the house. The warden's mark on his palm flared blue as he pressed it against the wood, activating the symbols with his blood connection. The totem responded immediately, glowing briefly before settling into a state of quiet vigilance. Through the mark, he felt the web of protection strengthen, 6 points now forming a complete circle around the house. Anyone approaching would experience a sudden, inexplicable urge to turn back, their minds filled with vague feelings of dread and memories of urgent tasks elsewhere. Makya stepped back to survey his work with satisfaction. Small birds had returned to the trees surrounding the clearing, a good sign. When he'd first become warden, no living creature would approach the house. Now, nearly a year later, the forest was healing, reclaiming its natural state as the entity's corruption receded. He sensed movement at the edge of his awareness, someone approaching the outer boundary. Not Keme or his father, whose presences he would recognize instantly. Someone unfamiliar, yet not entirely unknown. Closing his eyes, Makya extended his senses through the warden's mark, a young man moving cautiously through the trees, carrying a modern rifle similar to Ayana's. The set of his shoulders, the shape of his face, his grandson, Noshi, now a young man of 18, no longer the boy of 7 Makya had last seen. The realization struck with unexpected force. Time truly did flow differently here. What felt like months to Makya had been years for his family. Noshi had grown to manhood, while Makya tended the prison. The young man hesitated at the outer totem boundary, feeling its influence. Unlike ordinary travelers, however, he seemed to recognize the sensation for what it was. He touched the nearest totem curiously, fingers tracing the carved symbols with unexpected familiarity. Blood calls to blood. The binding recognized its own, even generations removed. For a moment, Makya considered calling out, beckoning his grandson across the boundary. The longing to connect with family, to speak with someone of his direct bloodline, was nearly overwhelming. But wisdom prevailed. Noshi was too young to understand the full burden of the warden's duty. His appearance here suggested Ayana or Keme had begun preparing him, teaching him the old ways, but he wasn't ready for the truth. Not yet. Instead, Makya stepped back into the shadow of the house, observing silently as Noshi studied the totems. The young man made a full circuit of the boundary, examining each post without attempting to cross. Finally, he left a small bundle at the edge of the perimeter, an offering of tobacco and corn meal wrapped in white cloth, before departing the way he had come. A proper offering in the old style. Someone had taught him well. Through the warden's mark, Makya sensed the house's reaction, a subtle shift in the binding, a recognition of potential succession. Someday, perhaps, Noshi would return to take up the burden when Makya could no longer maintain it. The thought brought both sadness and comfort. Retrieving the offering, Makya returned to the house. The single timber leg seemed to welcome him, adjusting its balance as he climbed the steps that appeared at his approach. Inside, he placed the bundle on a small altar that had formed near the central column. "Not yet," he told the house, feeling its eager anticipation through the mark. "He isn't ready." The timber leg pulsed once in acknowledgement, though Makya sensed disappointment in the response. The house was patient, but not infinitely so. The binding required a warden of the bloodline, and it had learned through centuries that mortals were fragile. Temporary things, Makya settled into his chair by the window, watching the forest where his grandson had disappeared. Time would continue its strange flow, but now with new purpose. He would prepare. He would record everything he had learned in the warden's journal. And when the time came, when Noshi or another of the bloodline was ready, he would ensure the transition of duty was smoother than his own had been. In the meantime, the warden's vigil continued. The winter solstice brought the shortest day of the year, and with it Keme's regular visit. He appeared at the edge of the clearing as the last light faded, moving carefully through the snow. His aged body now stooped with the years the clock had stolen combined with natural aging. Makia waited at the boundary, permitted this small freedom by the house, which seemed to understand the importance of these connections. In Keme's hands was a bundle wrapped in red cloth, the message bundle that connected Makia to the world beyond his prison. "Uncle," Keme greeted, his breath fogging in the cold air. The honorific had remained despite Makia now appearing much older than his nephew. "Nephew?" Makia embraced him briefly. "Your journey was safe. The totems guide me now, rather than warn me away." Keme smiled, the expression creating a web of wrinkles around his eyes. "Your skill has grown." They walked together to the house's edge, where a small fire burned in a pit that hadn't existed hours before, the house having prepared for this visit. They sat on stone benches, the bundle between them. "News from home?" Makia asked, trying to keep the eagerness from his voice. Keme nodded, unwrapping the bundle. Inside lay smaller packages. Dried herbs from his father, beadwork from Ayana, a carved wooden animal from his great-granddaughter he had never met. Beneath these gifts was the true purpose of the bundle: letters, drawings, and small totems that connected Makia to his people despite his isolation. "Your father's health fails," Keme said gently, handing over a leather pouch of sacred herbs. "He sends these with his blessing. He says to burn them when his spirit journeys onward. They will help you feel his passing and say goodbye." Makia accepted the pouch with a heavy heart. He had known this was coming, had felt it through the strange connection that linked him to his bloodline. But the confirmation still ached. "Ayana leads the council now," Keme continued, offering better news. "The first woman to do so in 4 generations. She speaks of you often to the young ones, though she calls you the Guardian rather than by name. Your sacrifice has become legend already, and knows she?" Makia asked, unable to contain his curiosity about his grandson. "He continues his training with your father while there is still time. He visited the boundary again last month." Keme gave him a knowing look. "You sensed it?" Makia nodded. "The house recognizes him. The blood calls to blood. He dreams of this place," Keme said carefully. "Of a house on one leg and a man whose face he cannot see. Your father says these are not ordinary dreams." The implications hung between them. The warden's duty was passing to the next generation, preparing Noshi even before Makia's time was done. "Is he ready?" Makia asked. Keme considered the question. "Not yet, but he will be when the time comes." They spoke long into the night, the fire never dimming despite the cold. Keme shared news of births and deaths, successes and struggles. The tribe was prospering again, the hunting grounds restored to abundance now that the entity's influence had receded. As dawn approached, Gem prepared to leave, gathering the wrappings of the message bundle. From his pocket, he produced one final item, a small, intricately woven bag containing something that rattled softly when moved. "From all of us," he explained, placing it in Makia's hands. "To remind you that though you stand alone, you are never forgotten." Inside the bag, Makia found small tokens from every family in the tribe: beads, carved stones, tiny bundles of sacred plants, each marked with the giver's personal symbol. The message was clear. His sacrifice protected them all, and they honored him for it. Emotion tightened Makia's throat. "Thank them for me," he managed. "They know," Keme assured him, rising to leave. "The boundary stones speak your gratitude in ways words cannot." At the edge of the clearing, they embraced once more. "Until spring," Kem promised. "Until spring," Makia echoed, knowing the house would mark the days until then, in its own mysterious way. As Keme disappeared into the trees, Makia returned to the house, the message bundle cradled carefully in his arms. The timber leg adjusted, swaying gently to admit him, the door appearing and disappearing as needed. Inside, Makia arranged the gifts on shelves that formed at his unspoken request. The message bundle would sustain him through the long winter months, reminding him of his purpose when the entity's whispers grew strongest during the dark nights ahead. He was the warden, isolated but not alone, imprisoned but with purpose. The contradiction that maintained the balance between worlds. The house creaked around him, settling back into its vigilant stance, balanced perfectly on its single leg, just as Makia balanced between duty and sacrifice, between imprisonment and purpose. Midnight found Makia kneeling before the central timber leg, tending to a small bowl of glowing blue embers that burned without fuel or smoke. The eternal flame, manifested from the binding itself, required daily attention from the warden, not to keep it burning, but to maintain the connection between keeper and kept. The flame's light cast long shadows across the room, illuminating the collected artifacts of his years as warden. The journal filled with his careful handwriting, the flute hanging on the wall, the blood quill in its holder, the warning totems carved but not yet placed. Makia passed his hand over the flame, the warden's mark on his palm resonating with its light. Below, deep in the foundation of the impossible house, he sensed the entity stirring briefly before settling back into dormancy. "Sleep," he whispered, though it needed no voice to hear him. The binding holds, the flame flickered in response, a pattern that Makia had learned to read over time. Confirmation, acceptance, the eternal dialogue between prison and warden. Outside, moonlight bathed the clearing in silver light. Through the window, Makia could see his boundary totems standing sentinel, their carved symbols faintly luminous in the darkness. Beyond them, the forest stretched peaceful and alive, healed from the corruption that had once seeped from this place. The house swayed gently on its single leg, a motion that had once seemed impossible, but now felt as natural as breathing. It adjusted to his movements as he rose, the floorboards creaking in familiar patterns. Makia moved to the window, gazing out at the night sky. Stars wheeled overhead, marking the passage of time in their ancient measured dance. How many wardens before him had stood at similar windows, watching the same stars? How many would come after? The burden he had taken up unwittingly now sat comfortably on his shoulders. Not lightweight, never that, but properly balanced. Purpose had given meaning to sacrifice. The eternal flame flickered behind him, casting his shadow long across the floor. In that stretched silhouette, Makia sometimes glimpsed not just his current self, but echoes of all he had been: the skeptical hunter, the dutiful son, the reluctant discoverer, and finally, the accepting warden. He touched the glass, cool beneath his fingertips. "Balance," he murmured, a personal mantra developed over his vigil. The house creaked in response, the timber leg adjusting minutely. Outside, the totems pulsed once in unison, responding to his word. His intent, balance, the flame seemed to echo. Its light steady and sure. Somewhere in the forest beyond his boundary, owls called to one another. Creatures lived and hunted, unaware of how close they dwelled to ancient danger, or of the solitary figure who ensured that danger remained contained, and that was as it should be. Makia returned to the eternal flame, kneeling once more before it. With practiced motions, he arranged the embers in the sacred pattern passed down through generations of wardens. The flame responded, shifting to a deeper blue at its core. The house settled on its impossible leg, perfectly balanced despite defying all natural laws. A testament to what will and sacrifice could maintain. Makia closed his eyes, palms upturned in the ritual of watchfulness that would carry him through until dawn. The warden's mark pulsed gently, a heartbeat synchronized with the binding itself. In the dark behind his eyelids, he sensed the entity dreaming its ancient dreams of freedom, its presence a cold counterpoint to the warm flame before him. Eternal opposites, forever in tension, and between them, maintaining the balance that protected the world beyond, the warden. Neither fully free nor fully imprisoned, but purposeful in his chosen duty. The house stood vigil on its single leg, swaying gently in a wind only it could feel. Inside, the ageless dance continued, light and shadow, freedom and containment, sacrifice and purpose. Balance in all things.